biosecurity matters. It saves lives. It protects Australians. It has a very important place in the broad range of things, particularly during a pandemic, where we should be ensuring that the biosecurity of all Australians is protected. But this government, and particularly that minister that is here in the chamber at this point in time, should hang their head in absolute shame for the grossest dereliction of duty that we have seen through the course of this pandemic. That this minister, who is responsible for this bill, demonstrated astounding incompetence of being unable to know what aspects of his own legislation covered the protection of Australians and their health. And in any of the critical remarks I make, Deputy Speaker, through this debate, I want to make it absolutely clear that none of this is directed to those public servants who do the public a great service at our airports and ports and who do the right thing to help protect Australians. My criticisms are not directed to them. In fact, my greatest compliments are directed to them for their public service. But the greatest criticism should go to their bosses. The greatest criticism should go to the ministers who failed the Australian public. We found the Department of Agriculture, and specifically this minister, wanting. This minister in particular, along with the Prime Minister and the Minister for Home Affairs, where biosecurity mattered in a pandemic, they were found wanting. And in particular, everyone knows, the country knows, the 2,700 people who were affected by coronavirus on the Ruby Princess, the 700 people who were infected by coronavirus on the Ruby Princess, the 20-plus Australians who lost their lives because they contracted coronavirus on the Ruby Princess. They lost their lives. They paid the price. And I get worked up about this issue, Deputy Speaker, because I think of all those passengers that went on that trip. They are just ordinary, average Australians, many of them older, who went the hard slog of their jobs. They paid off their mortgages, they raised their kids, they have grandchildren, and they went to take a cruise, like a lot of Australians do. And they treated themselves. And they went on those cruises thinking they'd have a great time. Those ordinary Australians that took that cruise should have had full confidence that their health and safety be protected, and that when they got off their cruise, they would not be attending a funeral. I genuinely feel for those people. I genuinely feel that we let them down. And I genuinely feel that at no point did this government ever step up. The government that is quick to point fingers at others never stepped up to take responsibility for themselves. In May, we heard that federal authorities were aware of 128 sick people aboard the Ruby Princess, including 24 with a temperature, on the evening before they were allowed to disembark. That's what the Senate COVID Committee was told. The Australian Border Force that said that they would control, as a result of the Prime Minister's declaration in mid-March, that they would control which cruise boats came in or didn't. They didn't tell the harbour master whether or not what he should or shouldn't do, and they claimed, Australian Border Force, they had no legislated authority to do that on a biosecurity threat. Because this minister who's responsible for this legislation and these protections, when quizzed about an act he was responsible for, said, and I quote, this is Agriculture Minister David Littleproud on RN Breakfast on the 14th of August. Well, let me make clear, the Federal Agricultural Agency only looks after plants and animals. They don't look after human health. Really. On his own website, the Department of Agriculture website, it says the Biosecurity Act, which is going to be amended here today by this legislation we're debating. The Biosecurity Act 2015 explains how we manage biosecurity threats to plant, animal and human health in Australia and its external territories, an act this minister administers and he doesn't even know is responsible for human health. But I'd put it to you, Deputy Speaker, it's not that he didn't know. It's that he didn't want to admit that this is what it was responsible for. The issue that was often put was that there weren't federal representatives on the Ruby Princess when it went to dock, claiming that in many instances it was New South Wales Health, but that was just wrong. And on top of that, the minister responsible for this act has repeatedly failed to explain the exact times that officials from his own department gave approval for people to disembark the Ruby Princess and therefore be responsible for the spreading of coronavirus in this country that reached places as far as Tasmania and pretty much triggered down the lockdown of that state as a result of lapses that can be attributable or attributed to this minister responsible for this Biosecurity Act. This minister responsible for this act refused to acknowledge or apologise for what his departmental secretary conceded to the committee, that the department itself failed to do the required traveller with illness checklists on board the Ruby Princess. What happened when a Queensland Premier writes to a Prime Minister and says about these very cards that we're debating here in this legislation, says at the start of the pandemic, Deputy Speaker, writes to the Prime Minister and urges them on the basis of contact tracing. They say they want to keep more data on travellers so they can contact trace. So the Queensland Premier writes to the Prime Minister and asks to get these cards. Because as the states were dealing with this huge influx of international travellers early in the year, all the states become shocked to learn, and I quote this from a Samantha Maiden piece in news.com.au back in September, and I'll quote directly. As the states dealt with the influx of international passengers, they were shocked to learn that incoming travellers' passenger cards were essentially thrown in the bin or unable to be accessed on privacy grounds. These same cards that we're getting told about here today play such an important role in biosecurity, and yet when the states ask for access to them to enable more efficient contact tracing to limit the spread of coronavirus, this government fails to do the job. And we've got ordinary Australians, as I said, just like those passengers on the Ruby Princess, that expect that governments will be there to protect them. But they're not. And at no point, neither the Prime Minister or the Minister for Home Affairs or that minister over there has ever stepped up and accepted responsibility. And why? Because they've spent too much time playing political games, trying to blame states. And this failure to be accountable by the federal government is letting Australians down. Their failure and their dereliction of duty is hurting Australians. It's caused the death of Australians. And that's why they don't accept responsibility. This minister is another example of the incompetence that led to the deaths of Australians, and this government should absolutely hang its head in shame for the way it let down ordinary Australians in this country.